Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Intelligence Summit. I'm Brandi Vincent, Defense Technology Correspondent for Nextgov, and I am so excited to welcome you to our first panel of the day, Harnessing Data. We know that data plays a key role in gaining an advantage over adversaries, but how exactly are leaders leveraging its power? What strategies and data-centric approaches allow for more strategic and efficient decision-making? Today, we'll be taking a closer look at all of that and more. Joining me, we have a fantastic panel. I'm so excited to welcome Tom Sasala, the Department of the Navy's Chief Data Officer, and Cynthia or Cindy Bedell, DEVCOM Army Research Lab's Director of the Communications and Information Sciences Directorate. Thank you guys both so much for being here. And with that, we'll just get started. I wanted to kick it off with a couple of sort of open questions to both of you. So first, what are some of the ways your organizations are using data as a strategic asset? Tom, let's start with you.
Sure, absolutely. So we've been working on this kind of data transformation now for a couple of years here in the Department of the Navy. And so what we've done is actually started early on is establishing the data management program itself. And then we're trying to pivot into the kind of using data to make decisions. And then ultimately our goal is to use data to drive operational effectiveness, right? And really create that operational advantage in a peer and near peer adversary sort of environment. So we've established an enterprise data platform itself. We are integrating data into that platform. We've formed the kind of governance around how we want to govern data, not only in the platform, but outside the platform. And then we've started creating what I would call more of the dashboard type analytics right now, the things that we can count. We're counting the things we can't count. We know that we can't count them. We can find them. And then using that to establish some visualizations that we can give to our senior leaders to answer their questions and kind of tuss out from them what their outcomes are that they're trying to drive, and then find the data and find the analytics and the algorithms to actually say what are the levers that we can pull to drive those outcomes. And then so we started doing that over maybe the last year, and that's going to be a focus over this coming year, as well as continuing our data inventory and continuing with those key questions through a process that we call Constellation, figuring out what those key questions are, and then going out and seeking the data and driving more analytics and just getting into that kind of battle rhythm of gathering the data, visualizing the data, analyzing the data, showing it to leaders, get that feedback, and then help all of our senior leaders across the Department of the Navy use that information to make better decisions.
Absolutely. And it's that rhythm is really important. But the ultimate idea is you want to be in a place where these senior leaders can approach you with a problem and you have the data and the resources to solve it, right?
Absolutely.
Cool. And Cindy, what about you guys? How are you using data as a strategic asset at ARL?
So ARL does the foundational research for the Army. And as such, we do the very early work, but we're embedded with the operators to collect data, label data, store data, refine it so that the data that's necessary is kept and the data that's not can be eliminated, because that saves time, space, money. We are really big in iteratively learning. So we're working the big experiment that Army Futures Command is doing every year to look at what opportunities are coming quickly out of technology areas. How can we assess it? How can we pull it into our program managers and our engineering centers to mature it and move it on? So data for any system that's relying on automated target recognition, autonomy of maneuver, simultaneous visualization at dispersed command sites. How do we bring the right data at the right time, in the right bandwidth, size, etc.? How do we do that? So we are experimenting, learning, and we have a large team doing the AI for Army intelligence that we have these sprint opportunities where we take data, we store data, we've parsed it into training data, verification data, and test data. And then we bring external partners in who know how to quickly sprint and do an algorithm to train their algorithm on the training data. then we test it with our verification data to see where there were mistakes. And then they are allowed to iterate through with their algorithm, revise it, maybe do human intervention or a different reward center to evaluate it. And then we verify that those changes have made it effective. And so we have data for all sorts of things, not just operational. We have it for language and information and even materials behavior, so we can predict better materials for the types of environments we're going to be in and how we're going to need to fix them. So it's really exciting because machine learning and AI can be applied across all of the domains at Army Research Lab.
Oh, and we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that, I think, in this panel. I'm glad you brought it up. But I want to stick with you for a second because both of you kind of sort of mentioned this. It's no easy task. So what are some of the challenges around data, the data-related challenges, if you will, that your organizations are facing in their work? Starting with you, Cindy.
So I would say the biggest challenge is that we do not have one standard, easily labeled, easily metadata stream of data. Okay, unlike the banking industry or consumer businesses who really can target the data they get, pull it in, run an algorithm on it, and it is very clear what they are studying and the trends that they're seeing and the inferences they can make. We don't have that, and we have, petadata. We have petabytes of data that we cannot label, have not labeled. So some of it is taking the data, having a human label it, and then having a human train an algorithm to correctly label it, and then let it run off and iterate. No, you're wrong there. That wasn't a truck. That was just a sofa. And really work with it to make sure that the algorithm is labeling it correctly before we then put that data in a repository where other people can use it. And so it's critical. We have lots of unlabeled data. We have lots of labeled data, but it has to be used for the right application. Not every algorithm is applicable to every piece of data and vice versa. And so that's some of the problem. And then just plain storage and access. Both of those are expensive. And some of our decision makers who don't play with data and don't understand the differences of data want us all to put the data in one single data storage center, have just one entity run the data storage center. We're not a business. We are not Google. We are not Amazon. We are special, and we do need special storage, special controls, multiple different types of data storage. And I think that's a challenge for us.
And it also kind of gets into articulating what your needs are when you're working with people who aren't just in data focused roles all the time. Tom, is there anything you want to add about, excuse me, the data related challenges that y'all are facing?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do share the same challenges that Cindy shares as well. I think that's pervasive not only in the military departments in the DoD, but it's pervasive across the federal government in large part. And when you do have an organization with such diverse data sets, as Cindy mentioned, and having some uniquenesses and some commonalities, right? It's really hard. I would actually say we collectively have a slightly more fundamental challenge that is more difficult to get over than just some of the technological issues with interoperability and data standards, and that's an acumen and a skill set problem. And that is, Cindy alluded to it at the end, senior leaders wanting all the data to be in one location, and they just want to munge on it in one location, which is physically impossible for the Department of the Navy. It's just as challenging for the Army as well, having been the CEO for the Army for a while. We have a very diverse workforce, but more importantly, we have a highly expeditionary workforce. It's not dissimilar to census or IRS field office or FBI officers that are out in the field. Now, in many cases, that's in the kind of CONUS United States, so that critical infrastructure in CONUS is a little bit more beefy than maybe out in the Indo-Pacific Sea or something like this, right? But having to recognize that we have carrier strike groups and carriers themselves generating terabytes of data per day. It is physically impossible to bring all that data back anywhere to land and have it processed exclusively on land, right? So training our workforce, training our senior leadership to understand that there's a distributed data architecture that has to be implemented. The right services at the right place for the right purpose have to be implemented. That requires funding, it requires time, it requires diligence and patience, right? And then the second part of training, which is something that I'm trying to tackle head on, which I know is happening in the Army and the Air Force as well, but it's just the general data acumen around the individual, the knowledge workers, the people that are in the employment of the Department of Navy and Air Force and Army, right? They're all digital citizens of one form or another, whether you're a digital native or kind of a digital immigrant, as the old terminology that some of the leadership were saying before. The acumen problem from the basics will resolve itself over time, because kids in high school today and into college are digital natives, and they just understand it, they get it. They'll probably step back a few decades in their technology career by coming to the DoD to a certain extent. However, what we need to do is we need to bridge that gap for the next 20 some odd years until the workforce is kind of in a different position. And even then, 20 years from now, the workforce that'll be kind of in the senior leadership position will understand technology of today, not technology of 20 years ago, right? So creating that sustained program that keep people up to date, keep them trained, keep them in tune with where the rest of the universe is going. And, Cindy mentioned the banking industry. We're trying to establish a program of technology infusion on our side about, and we don't want to leapfrog too far, because we have some catch up to play, right? So just simply saying, give me a little bit of that AI and ML, that's great. But without some of those foundational services that I talked about, you can't get there from here. And so that's another different kind of form of training. But let's say that we have that capability like we do in our enterprise data platform, as the Army has in Vantage, as we have in Jupiter, right? How do we use that technology there and exploit it for maximum benefit, right? And where does it make sense to use a technology like Jupiter versus something at the edge like we're doing in Overmatch, or Army's doing in Convergence or something like that? And we need to have that open and transparent conversation amongst ourselves about what is optimal, right? And kind of put aside some of what I would say the tool preference is that people have. People are like, well, I want this tool. Well, okay, that tool's really great for this problem, but we've got more problems than that, right? So we are engaging in that acumen, that upskilling of the workforce. The creation of a data series at OPM is important. But just there's no, for the Army, right? There's no MOS for data people. Right. It took us 10, 15, maybe 20 years to get a cyber classification on people. Now we need to start talking about how do we characterize our people as data individuals. And so we in the Department of Navy, we've defined 3 big broad buckets that we're going after, and we're going to tag our individuals, the positions, and the associated people that are in those positions as needing certain data skills, and then go after some training. And I hope that it's not going to be one of those compliance, I took my data training this year, right? But it's going to be more, how do I use data in my job? Because I've actually had people say, well, I'm not a data person. And I'm like, you're literally sitting here in a palm brief looking at a PowerPoint chart of pie graphs and in a scroll diagram of spend. What do you think that is if it's not data, right? And so you in your mind, you're doing that math, you're doing that calculus, saying, hey, wait a minute, the requirement is this and the funding is that. There's a delta, right? That's data analysis, right? And so I actually had that conversation with someone recently, and they kind of had that I say the V8 moment, but that dates me a little bit. The light bulb went on, right? And it's like, oh, wait a minute. So maybe I am a data person. I just don't know what a data architecture is, or I can't tell you what an ontology is and things like this. That's not what I'm talking about. That's kind of 201, not 101, right? And so we're trying to do that 101, 201. 301, 401 sort of thing. You don't have to be a PhD data scientist to figure out that we have more requirements than we have funding.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's important work, and y'all are busy for sure. I appreciate a lot of the points you made there, and I want to stick with you for a second, because you mentioned your previous work and the position you're in now. There has been an increase in the number of chief data officers across the government in recent years for a variety of reasons. They range from one-person bands to large teams. Can you describe your team and sort of the skill sets and engagement that you have across the Navy?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the Department of Navy, we have the chief data officer at the secretariat level. In my office, I have a deputy, chief data officer, as well as I created a separate role for the chief analytics officer. And so the whole idea there is that me and my deputy as the CDO would focus on some of those data management issues, kind of building out that data architecture, whereas the chief analytics officer and the deputy chief analytics officer are focused on exploiting the data once it becomes available, once it's cleaned, once it's curated. And so he's a wonderful human being who understands regression algorithms and the efficacy of data sourcing and all the stuff that I understand intrinsically, but don't have time to worry about. And so we wanted to break that role up. Now at the big DoD level, they have created a chief, now it's now called a chief digital and AI officer, right? That has the CDO in it. But what they're doing is they're taking all the different piece parts of the OSD, the DoD level, right? And they're putting them into one office to provide that focus, to provide that unity of effort, right? And so you're taking the AI, the ML, you're taking a little bit of that DevSecOps goodness from the Defense Digital Services. You're taking the Chief Data Office as well as the larger analytical platform. To do that business health metrics and those operational metrics, you're putting it in one organization and you're providing that focus. And that's something that Secretary Hicks is doing right now. I think there's goodness there. The Department of the Navy is not quite there yet. The Army is, I think, closer than we are with they do have a chief data and analytics officer, but it is in the CIO, right? And the Air Force is kind of on their path as well, although they're kind of separated from the CIO. So we're all a little bit different. We have our strengths and our weaknesses. My team is very small. Being in the Secretariat at the Dawn, we do have two military services, the U.S. Navy and U.S. Marine Corps. They are very large, right? So what we're trying to do is provide that oversight, that guidance, and give them the tools that they need to execute. So we kind of tell them what needs to get done, and they tell us how they're going to do it, and that's how it works for us. Again, it's different than the Air Force and the Army per se. So relatively small team, but I think there's an advantage there, right? And there is also an advantage for us being embedded in the CIO because we do get to use that infrastructure of decades long, funding, plumbing, technology, infusion. They have a lot of the tools from an IT program management perspective that we need as data professionals to find all the data and inventory it, right? So there's some advantages there, but I also see advantages where, Secretary Hicks has taken big OSD, which is really putting a finer focus on it. So I see, it's evolving over time, and as the Open Government Data Act and the Chief Data Officers kind of proliferate, and you're seeing it right now that we just did our CDO survey, and last year I want to say we were in a 60% range of CDOs that were either the CIO or in the CIO office. This year it's in the 20% range, which is very informative. Hopefully Ken and the team will release the report soon, but I remember him saying that, of the 80 some people in the CDO council, there's less than 10 now, I think, that are, in the CIO office, which is really fascinating, right? And so if it's not in the CIO office, where is it? How do they work with the CIO and the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, right? That triad there, because I actually brought this up at the OSD level because we have overlapping policies. Now that I'm statutorily responsible for information resources management, well, so is the CIO and so is the CISO, and now the PCA, right? So we do have to deconflict a little bit of that. So again, that's a little bit of an advantage of being in the CIO. You can work closely on it. But it's just something that's, I say it's a program of progress, not perfection.
No, that's awesome. And I actually am so happy that you mentioned that transition that's happening at the bigger level with the CDAO and that office. Being on the inside and sort of being in that, do you feel like establishing the CDAO was just a natural point in the evolution of where the department is going with AI and data, et cetera?
I do. I think what it was is it took time for people to get there. And again, I've been around the block a few times, right? And I saw the evolution of the CIO from what it was to what it is now. I saw the creation of a CISO position, right? It was a former CIO job, right? And now it's a separate thing. And there's actually some language in the hearing recently on the Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, which contains that Open Government Data Act, that talks about the CIOs being overloaded and having too much to do, and the need to maybe separate the roles a little bit. So it is a natural evolution. I think for the DoD, we're probably ahead of most, but for the DoD, it was more about focus and operational effectiveness, right? The recognition that AI and ML runs on data without high quality data that you can trust, that is timely and protected. most importantly, whether it's training data or really operational data. You have to put those things together, and there are equities from the CIO and from the CISO. Don't get me wrong, but continuing to have that AI and ML separate from the data team, separate from the analytics and the exploitation team that are kind of, well, I would say that customer or user focused requirement things, was really creating inefficiencies. And no matter how you organize, there will be gaps and seams. In this case, they've closed a lot of the gaps in that area, which I do think will make us move a lot faster.
That's great. It sounds really promising. Thank you for that. Cindy, I am excited because at the top of the conversation, you too mentioned AI and ML and sort of some of the work you guys have going on. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you're incorporating emerging technologies into your mission, and how much is commercial off-the-shelf tech versus actual customized technology?
So when our commercial partners are going to do it anyway, we want to be able to harness their tools, harness their equipment, and maybe do some modification to add security, like Tom talked about, whether it's for data protection, algorithm protection, access protection, comms protection. We want to be able to add that extra layer of security that a commercial system might not have. Where the commercial space is not going to go into where we need them to go, we are going to do focused research to get there. So one of the things that we're going to need as an Army is AI, machine learning at the tactical edge. And what's the problem with the tactical edge? Low power. We need low weight, because we're not going to have a ton of extra power in our vehicles. If it's a dismounted unit there, it's all batteries right now. And so how do we get very lightweight, neuromorphic or conformal neural networks, some kind of thing that works very low weight, low power, but highly efficiently on the types of problems we want it to solve? And then also be able to have it ingest local data as the situation changes, do data assessment on the device. So it's not having to send it up to the cloud and bring it back down when we don't have the bandwidth or power. Do that data assessment on the device, send that answer to perhaps another algorithm that then builds the situational awareness. How do we get those kinds of devices? Well, in a lot of cases, our Sensors and Electronic Devices Directorate proves proof of principle, builds an early scale prototype, and then partners with an existing foundry, an emerging business, a university that has an incubator center, and build them to prove that they work, and then take them out in small operational tests to see if they really truly perform in an operational environment, and then bring it back and turn it into a program that our centers do with their production partners, or even straight to the PEO if it's something that can plug and play with a comm system they're already using or a computer system they're already using. It really depends on the application, but we have lots of these very targeted small efforts that actually will have big payoff in the long run. And it really helps us to have really trusted partners, whether they're academic, small business, commercial business, to help us drive the technology where we need it to go.
That's awesome. Tom, is there anything you want to add about emerging technology and data that y'all are working on or that excites you?
Yeah, so we have a similar sort of construct that Cindy and the Army has. I would just say our operations are a little bit more distributed. We do have the Navy and the Marine Corps, which have distinctly unique requirements given certain operational needs, right? And so the Marine Corps' requirements from a communication perspective is more closely aligned to the Army than it is to what I would say the surface and the subsurface fleet. But even then, we have air, surface, and subsurface, right? And so the research that we're doing, for example, on the surface fleet is completely different than the type of research that's going for subsurface, right? So for target classification for sonar is a little bit different than full motion video for the surface fleet or even the air fleet, right? And so to Cindy's point, right, there's uniquenesses there that you need different types of algorithms. And the algorithm that I would run to predict tomorrow's weather is not the algorithm that I would run to tell me whether or not it's a friend or foe. Right. And so that's really important goes back to the acumen thing, too. It's important to understand that there's not just one AI. Right. And the other thing that I would mention, that it's an area of research for us that has been a challenge since I was in the Navy the first time, unfortunately, in the 90s, which is really the different levels of communication that we have to establish. And the basic communication at that most fundamental waveform level is a challenge when you're operating globally. Right. There are some areas of the globe that you can use certain spectrum that you can't use in other areas. There's certain times where you don't want to emit electromagnetic radiation too much, because then you become a very findable target. And when you're out in the open ocean and you don't want to be found, that's important to understand, what is your electromagnetic spectrum. And I know the Army was having some issues with that with their talks in the CPC, the Command Post Computing Environment as well. And so these are just things that, Cindy mentioned. Industry doesn't worry about these things, right? I got some IoT devices in my house, and I don't know how far they're emanating, but I'm sure the neighbors could see them and do whatever they want to them. Maybe turn the temperature up in the house or something. I don't know. But the point is, that's bad from an operational security perspective. And so, just understanding that there are uniquenesses there. But I think one of our challenges is understanding that there's also commonality there. And we don't need to do it all ourselves, right? And so, and I said this when I was on Army staff as well, right? Why are we building our own radio when the Marine Corps already has one, right? Why don't we just use theirs? And I got lots of reasons for why it's challenging, but no real good reasons why it's not a good idea.
Absolutely. Well, I gotta say, I really appreciate both of you guys sharing some of those kind of use cases or applications that are playing out. It certainly sounds like exciting work. We're about to come to a close, but as a journalist, I would be remiss if I didn't ask at least one question about what's fresh and new. And unfortunately, right now, that is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Can both of you talk to us a little bit about how your organization's priorities associated with technology and data in this conflict might be shifting? Tom, starting with you.
Sure, absolutely. So, one of the realizations I guess I've had because of Ukraine and some of the other world dynamics is we have to have the ability to support highly episodic scenarios, right? And so our reaction to Ukraine, in large part from my perspective at the Secretariat level, is more of a readiness position, right? Are we postured for that kind of fight tonight or fight tomorrow sort of war? It's not so much what the COCOMs are doing, which is fighting the war and getting more of that operational red force, blue force sort of thing happening there. So the kind of epiphany that I had is we should probably have some enduring capability, reserved capacity for episodic events in the world that we can respond to very quickly. And so, honestly, the way that we responded to, the situation in Afghanistan not so long ago, as well as Ukraine, is we just stop doing something else and we start doing this. And that may be appropriate depending on what we're doing, but in many cases it's not. Right. So having those tools in place, having the procedures in place, and not just throwing out the security manual and saying, the heck with all of that, we're just going to do it because we have to, because the world's imploding. But really having some well-processed, well-established processes in place to allow us to be dynamic and know when we need to take risk. That's my kind of strategic take of all of this. And so we have contributed. Old resources often contributed to the actual fight right now. We have folks that are in theater and doing works there, and we're gathering data kind of on the backside to kind of feed the questions and the answers that is happening there. So in that regard, I say it's really two-pronged, right? I really try to take a more long-term approach to these sort of episodic things, because the reality is we're in the Defense Department and we're defending the nation, and there's all form of adversaries that are really probably not ever going to go away. So we should just get into the battle rhythm, knowing that we don't know when, but we know that it will happen. So let's go ahead and set up this environment we can be reactive in a much more timely manner. So that's kind of where we are right now.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Tom. And what about you, Cindy, at the laboratory? Is there anything you can add to that?
So one of the most interesting things about what's happening in that area of the world right now is that everyone's watching. They are seeing real time how this unfolds. And it's not just the media that's presenting it to us, it's everybody. And so a lot of things were easily predicted if we were watching patterns of life. And that's something that we do as an Army. But I think we weren't paying attention to all the patterns of life because we might have known when things were happening sooner. So some of this is we're really looking at what is patterns of life telling us, what tools can we have in place to give us early warning when patterns of life change. The other thing that is of high interest is how cyber and disinformation are playing a key role in this effort. And that's a huge mission for us, is the cyber defense. We at ARL don't do offense, but we do tell the folks that do offense what's been coming in on the defensive side that they might want to be thinking about. So there's another entity in the Army that looks at how to cause effects in a region. But just watching that and watching the volunteers, the non-military volunteers going over to thwart some of the aggressors' cyber effects. It's been absolutely fascinating to watch. How do we continue to shape what our independent actors are doing so that it affects in the right way and doesn't cause problems for us in the effects we might be trying to do as a Department of Defense. And so those are kind of the two big things for me, is the early warning from patterns of life. And then how do we harness all of these volunteers that have skills that we don't necessarily have as much in the Department of Defense? How do we harness them, use them, affect their enthusiasm, and help them shape what they're doing so it is something that we can respond to and use once we reach a steady state and can go back to a peaceful state. So that's really what I've been thinking about.
That's incredible. Both really just thoughtful and helpful answers, and I really appreciate it. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for today. Full disclosure to our audience, news happens fast, and this was pre-recorded on March 16th, so that's as up to date as it is. Tom and Cindy, thank you both so much for being here and sharing those insights. We really appreciate it, and I learned a lot. To our audience, we're so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to stick around for the rest of today's summit. Up next is a conversation on AI technology presented by our elite underwriter, Leidos. For Nextgov, I'm Brandi Vincent, and I'll see you next time.